Hi there, guys. My name is Siobhan Fallon. I'm an Army spouse and an author, and today we'll be discussing part 2 of Fred and Frabbie Benteen. So Benteen's early days with the Seventh Cavalry, his early conflicts with George Armstrong Custer, with a special focus on the Battle of the Washita. For those of you who are familiar with the history of the Seventh Cavalry, you know that the Washita fight was a defining moment, and Benteen would never forgive Custer for his actions that day, and we're going to kind of try and figure out if Custer deserved all of that blame or not. For those of you who did not see part 1, please do, but that focused on Benteen's early life, his Civil War career, his marriage to Catherine Louise Norman, and also some dramatic infighting between officers in Benteen's previous battalion, and dramatic infighting between Benteen and his Confederate-loving father. So please check that out. But we finished with Benteen arriving at Fort Riley, Kansas, and his first meeting with Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer in 1867. Did not go well. Today we're going to open up with the second meeting. All right, thanks again, guys, for joining. Let's go. So we just mentioned the rather uncomfortable first meeting between George Custer and Fred Benteen that took place in January 1867 at Fort Riley, Kansas, when they both discussed their Civil War records. Now, the second meeting wasn't much better. According to Benteen and what he claimed was his, quote, unbiased view, the day after he met Custer, he was invited to the Custer home again for a game of draw poker. Which makes me think Custer at least did not realize the meeting with his new 7th Cavalry captain went badly. Or if he did, he was determined to win Benteen over. The game started out with 5 players and 10-cent bets, and Custer did a lot of the winning. But when his wife Elizabeth, or Libby, went to bed, and 2 of the other men ran out of money and went home, Custer, Thomas Weir, and Benteen remained, and the bets jumped to $2.50. They played all night, with Custer making repeated trips to the bedroom to get more cash from his wife, until morning revelry. Benteen would claim that he won every penny, with Thomas Weir giving him an IOU for $155. Benteen would also say, quote, a good poker player must be a good judge of character, and I had Custer sized. So let's set this up just a little bit. The Army troops in Kansas were concentrated in forts or outposts roughly along the newly constructed railroad lines and emigrant trails. The infantry often served as security for the railroad crews, and the cavalry often made up a strategic strike force that was capable of pursuing Native American raiders. The cavalry, such as the 7th Cavalry, was split up in companies from east to west and would often only come together when an expedition was planned. In March of 1867, Major General Winfield Hancock, the department commander, planned to march on the Plains tribes, primarily the southern Cheyenne. There had been continuous bloodshed in western Kansas and eastern Colorado, repeated raiding, killing of white settlers, assaults and abductions of women and children, attacks on ranchers, stage stations, railroad construction crews, etc. General Hancock put together a plan for combined infantry, artillery, and cavalry, thinking a strong show of force might end these attacks and push the Cheyenne into reservations. Now, for us today, looking back, we have a tendency to break these moments into singular historical events or standalone moments, like the Sand Creek Massacre, the Saline and Solomon River raids, or even the Battle of the Washita. And this particular summer campaign is often referred to as the, quote, Hancock War. But at the time, this is an ongoing and continuous conflict, Each fight and skirmish was triggered or considered retaliation for something else. On March 27, 1867, Kate Benteen gave birth to their first son, Frederick Wilson Benteen. It would be 11 months before Benteen got to meet little Freddie. On that very same day, March 27th, General Hancock led his expedition out of Fort Riley, Kansas, accompanied by 4 companies of the 7th Cavalry. The Hancock campaign was a failure. At one point, they were met by Cheyenne warriors outside their village at Pawnee Fork. When negotiations didn't go anywhere, Hancock ordered Custer and the 7th to surround the village. By the time the 7th got there, they found that all of the Cheyenne had already disappeared, but they left their 150 teepees and all their belongings behind. When Hancock later learned of another Cheyenne attack at a stage station, with the stock run off, the stage station burned, and the citizens killed, Hancock decided to burn the abandoned Pawnee Fork village and everything in it. Tensions were running high. Months passed. Custer couldn't find the Cheyenne, but the Cheyenne kept finding the soldiers. G Company Commander Captain Albert Barnitz, who was stationed at Fort Wallace, wrote about the frustration soldiers felt about civilians back east not understanding what the soldiers were up against. Quote, "It must seem very amusing to people in Ohio to be told that certain of their acquaintances are really engaged in war in these, to them, peaceful times. I suppose they can't realize it at all. And yet out here is the serious business of our lives. To see a poor fellow with his scalp gone and his body full of bullet holes and revenge arrows, his clothes taken off and his limbs gashed in every conceivable manner, that is what we are compelled to witness daily here." As clashes between the Plains tribes and the soldiers increased, so did the enlisted soldier desertions. In the week leading up to July 7th, 34 men of the 7th Cavalry deserted. During a mass breakout on July 7th in broad daylight, Custer ordered fleeing deserters shot. 3 men were shot, 1 died. Benteen would write, quote, "Dismounted deserters were shot down while begging for their lives by Major Joel Elliott, Tom Custer, and W.W. Cook, Executioner-in-Chief." There were other violent dramas playing out too. One night, heavy-drinking 7th Cavalry officer Major Wycliffe Cooper was killed, which Benteen blames on Custer, saying, quote, "Cooper, being out of whiskey, shot himself, suicide, because the damn fool doctor acting out orders from Custer wouldn't even give him 1 drink to straighten out on." Meanwhile, 25-year-old Lieutenant Lyman Kidder of the 2nd Cavalry was sent on very hazardous duty. Kidder, who had only recently arrived at Fort Sedgwick, was sent on June 29th to deliver a message to Custer from General Sherman, accompanied with only 10 men and 1 Lakota scout named Red Bead. On July 11th, Custer's command found Kidder and his small patrol butchered. Every member of the party had been scalped, noses hacked off, clothing removed. Some were found lying in beds of ashes that indicated they had been put to death by torture. 4 days later, on July 15th, Custer decided to take about 100 men and march east 150 miles from Fort Wallace to Fort Hays, then on to Fort Riley. Whether it was to make contact with his higher command and secure supplies to help alleviate the dire situation at Fort Wallace, or to see his wife Libby at Fort Riley, because he feared a growing cholera epidemic, or just because the stress and violence of the past month had been too much. The reasons are still debated today. To make matters worse, during that long trek, 2 of Custer's men fell behind and 1 was killed by Indians. Custer was court-martialed for that mad dash to Libby, for absence without leave, and for failing to take the proper measures to secure the safety of the stragglers who had fallen behind. Captain West, who was under charges himself from Custer for repeated instances of drunkenness on duty, added an additional charge of prejudice to good order and military discipline against Custer for having the deserters shot on July 7th, as 2 of the deserters had fled from West's Company K. Captain Benteen, whose company had the highest desertion rate in the regiment, also took down affidavits of men who had complained about the way Custer treated the troopers. Benteen and West forwarded those complaints on to General Hancock. Custer's trial took place at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, from September 15th to October 11th, 1867. Custer was found
guilty
of 5 of the 11 charges and specifications. His court-martial sentence was that he was suspended from rank and command for 1 year and forfeit of pay for the same period. Benteen would later write, quote, "We were free at Custer." There were already emerging pro-Custer and anti-Custer camps within the 7th Cavalry. Edward S. Godfrey would remember joining the 7th Cavalry at a West Point and how, quote, "During the winter of 1867 to 1868, we were stationed at Fort Leavenworth. One evening while I was shaving, Johnson said, 'Gotti, what are you going to do about this Custer business? It looks as though we've got to take sides with one or the other.' I turned to him, razor in hand, and said, 'Johnson, I'm not going to take side with either faction. It all happened before we joined, and I can't say that it's any business to take sides.' He pondered that a while and replied, 'Well, if that's your decision, I'll stand with you.' I replied that it was my decision to keep out of it. The result was that I was not in the confidence of either side, but I sure caught hell from the anti-Custerites." This would prove to be a really good year for Benteen. He settled in nicely at Fort Harker, Kansas, and whatever he may have thought of Custer, there were plenty of other officers in the 7th whom he respected. He would call this particular group of friends the, quote, "mess of 7, meaning 7 officers of the original 7th Cavalry who messed or ate together. This group included Benteen himself, of course, former school teacher and acting commander during George Custer's absence, Major Joel Elliott, Benteen's adjutant of H Company, Canadian-born First Lieutenant William Weiner Cook, M Company Commander, First Lieutenant Owen Hale, Second Lieutenant of H Company Donald McIntosh, who was part Native American, Captain Robert West of K Company, Captain Edward Myers of E Company. Benteen would find himself the acting commander of Fort Harker for a couple months. He took advantage of that role and took horses that were meant for the 10th Cavalry, switching these new horses out with mounts from his H Company and Owen Hale's M Company. It didn't go smoothly. Complaints reached General Sheridan, but Benteen did manage to hold on to these nice new horses for now. Kate and little Freddie joined Benteen there in February 1868. Here is a description of Kate from another military spouse. "Mrs. Benteen came down the steps to welcome us. She was tall and thin, the antithesis of her stocky, handsome husband. She greeted us with flattering cordiality." In April 1868, 7th Cavalry Captain Albert Barnetz, campaigning with Major Elliott, writes to his wife, We remain encamped near Fort Harker today. The ladies of the post visit us this afternoon. They came over in their elegant private ambulances, Mrs. English, Miss Benteen, and others. All the officers of the regiment are invited to the post tonight for a ball given in our honor. And the summer brought baseball. Benteen's H Company would defeat West's K Company. Baseball was a passion of Benteen's, and he would later organize an H Company team called the Benteen Baseball Club. Benteen would whoop other adversaries on the plains as well. That summer brought more bloody raids in Kansas, especially in the Saline and Solomon River settlements. Benteen, in an engagement at Elkhorn Creek near the Saline River, would lead a small force of 30 cavalry men against a Cheyenne war party of over 200 braves. When they were surprised by the cavalry, the warriors released 2 little girls they had abducted. After this fight and others, Benteen was considered a hero to the settlers of central Kansas. And his wife Kate was pregnant again. There were plenty more skirmishes between the Plains tribes. 9 companies of the 7th Cavalry, led by Major Joel Elliott in Custer's absence, accompanied General Sully, but these attempts against the Cheyenne would be fruitless. Meanwhile, General Sheridan had taken the place of General Hancock, and although these numbers are under dispute, Sheridan would estimate that the Southern Cheyenne had killed 110 civilians, brutally assaulted 13 women, killed or captured 1,000 heads of livestock, not to mention the loss of personal property like farmhouses, barns, and stagecoaches. Frustrated by the Army's inability to stop it, Sheridan called Lieutenant Colonel Custer out of suspension. Custer returned in late September 1868. One of the first things Custer does is have the 7th Cavalry adhere to a European tradition of, quote, coloring the horses. Each company would have the same colored mounts. Benteen was not happy, and all those fine new horses he had taken from the 10th Cavalry were now divvied up amongst everybody. Benteen would write 19 years later in the margins of Custer's memoir, Wildlife on the Plains, quote, while I was absent, Custer caused the horses of the regiment to be colored, thus depriving my troop of very much better than they got in the exchange. This act on the beginning of a severe campaign was not only ridiculous but criminal, unjust, arbitrary in the extreme. It was done because mine was the best mounted troop. Yes, you scoundrel, you robbed me of a fine lot of horses through spite. The winter campaign against the Cheyenne began on November 12, 1868. Benteen would be leaving an 8-month pregnant Kate and a 20-month-old little Freddie behind at Fort Harker. Sheridan's orders to Custer were, quote, kill or hang all warriors and bring back all women and children. Here is Benteen's photo of the officers of the 7th Cavalry, dated in Benteen's hand as November 1868. Benteen is not in the photo, and he writes on the picture, quote, the invitation to be photoed was rather in the shape of an informal order, and though Colonel West and myself were present, we would not consent to being photoed. We were not, quote, stuck on George Armstrong Custer. This is a photo of Custer with the Osage, members of the Osage tribe who scouted and fought alongside the 7th Cavalry during this campaign. And they were traditional enemies of the Southern Cheyenne. On November 26th, after a storm, Captain Albert Barnett's, leading Elliott's battalion through the thick snow, found what was considered to be a war party trail of 100 to 200 Indian braves. He said he could distinguish the trail as a raiding party or war party because there was no travois trails, which would mean women and children, and also no sign of dogs, which would mean a hunting party. Trusted scout and interpreter Ben Clark, leading the Osage, would also agree that they were tracking a war party. The Osage scouts said they could smell wood fires and hear the tinkling of horse herd bells and the occasional bark of a village dog and a baby crying in the distance. This proved that they had found the Cheyenne village. The command was about 800 strong, and it was divided into 4 columns of roughly the same number of men in each. Remember, Major Elliott was Custer's second in command. Now, if you look at this map, you can kind of see the outline that each column would follow in the blue dotted paths. The first column, Custer would lead Company A with Captain Lewis Hamilton, Company C, Company D, led by Weir, Company K, which west, and 40 sharpshooters under Cook, as well as the Osage scouts, and Custer would go directly through the village. The second column, Major Elliott would lead Companies G, Captain Barnett's, Company H, Fred Benteen, to a position in the rear of the village. Third company be led by Captain Thompson with companies B and F, and this column had the farthest to go to get into position. The fourth column was led by Captain Myers, who would lead Company E and I in the valley and in the timber. The regimental band went with Custer. They were to strike up or play as soon as the attack was to begin. And there was no way Custer would know if everyone was in place. They were getting in position in the middle of the night. So just as it grew light, a single shot rang out from the village, and Custer quickly turned to the band leader and signaled him to play Gary Owen. Custer would write, quote, "Bugles sounded the charge, and the entire command dashed rapidly into the village. The Indians quickly overcame their first surprise, and in an instant seized their rifles, bows, and arrows. Mingled with the exultant cheers of my men could be heard the defiant war whoop of warriors who from the first fought with a desperation and courage which no race of men could surpass." As planned, Custer went directly through the village. Following that opening charge, Custer would set up a command post on a knoll just on the opposite end of the village. Major Elliott led his companies, including Benteen's H Company, to a position in the rear of the village. Colonel Thompson would lead companies B and F, which were meant to connect from the other side with Elliott. Myers led companies E and I in the valley and timber. Hamilton, the grandson of founding father Alexander Hamilton, rode next to Custer, and he was shot and killed in the opening charge. Barnett's, who was with Elliott's column, was also shot, and everyone assumed it was a fatal wound, but he would live. Custer wrote in his memoir, "Major Benteen, in leading the attack of his squadron, encountered an Indian boy. The boy rode boldly toward the major. His youthful bearing induced Major Benteen to endeavor to save him by making peace signs to him and obtaining a surrender. But with revolver in hand, he dashed at the major, leveling his weapon as he rose, and fired. The shot whistled harmlessly by Major Benteen's head. Another followed in quick succession. A third bullet was sped on its errand, and this time some purpose, as it passed through the neck of the major's horse, close to the shoulder. Making a final appeal for him to surrender, but seeing him still preparing to fire again, the major was forced in self-defense to level his revolver and dispatch him, although he did it with admiration for the plucky lad, and regret, often expressed, that no other course under the circumstance was left to him. Now Thompson was late in closing his part of the circle around the village, and it's through that gap that villagers started to flee. Major Elliott spotted the fleeing villagers and with a group of soldiers supposedly shouted to Lieutenant Owen Hale, "Here goes for a brevet or a coffin," and began to pursue the escapees. He was followed by 16 men from Benteen and Myers battalions. The young warrior who killed Benteen's horse could have saved his life because Benteen could not follow Elliott. Elliott and the men with him were never seen alive again, and his death would haunt the 7th Cavalry. Though the center of the village was taken in minutes, there remained pockets of resistance with scattered heavy fighting for hours. The 7th gathered up the women and the children, as well as the pony herd. At about 10 a.m., Custer noticed warriors accumulating on a knoll about a mile from the village. He had his interpreter talk to one of the captured Southern Cheyenne women, who revealed there were more villages beyond. Nearly all the hostile Southern tribes, Kiowa, plenty more Cheyenne, Comanches, and Apache, were stretched in miles. Custer could see these new warriors beginning to surround the village, and he could see that the 7th would soon be outnumbered. So you can imagine it was with tremendous relief when Quartermaster Major James Bell, quote, appeared on the ground with several thousand rounds of carbine ammunition, a reinforcement greatly needed. Bell and the pack train had been left behind the night before in fear that if they drew closer, the creaking of the wagons and ambulances would be heard. He had been informed that the attack would be made at daybreak, and he was expected to move forward as soon as he heard firing. Fortunately, Bell followed his orders exactly and may have saved the day. Fighting started up again with this new attack from the fresh warriors. Quote, Colonels Weir, Benteen, Myers, and their respective squadrons engaged the enemy, and they drove the warriors off. Benteen will say that Custer, quote, had endeavored to the best of his ability to get Colonel Myers and myself killed at the Washita, but from all other accounts, Benteen did all right. Here is Sergeant Ryan's description. Quote, Captain Benteen, with a detachment of 2 companies, divided into 4 platoons, made a charge. That was the prettiest sight I have ever witnessed, and while they were charging the Indians, we held our fire. The Indians were driven in great confusion, and I never saw troops in an engagement act in such splendid manner, or keep their line under such fire as these men did. Now it's about 3 p.m. The 7th Cavalry had captured 53 women and children. They also had more than 800 ponies, a village full of supplies, food, and weapons. Custer also had wounded soldiers. He was surrounded on all sides and greatly outnumbered. He believed he had no choice but to commit a, quote, cruel but necessary act, and to kill the captured ponies. Remember, these are cavalrymen. They are nothing without horses. When you read any of their writings, they always talk about their horses fondly. This could not have been easy for them. But the ponies, they knew, were not just the Cheyenne's pets. They were the greatest weapon the Southern Cheyenne had for transportation and for attack. Custer would also burn the village and destroy all the contents. Custer claimed that a thorough search had been made for Major Elliott and his men, though Benteen would claim the opposite. Custer, about an hour before sunset, moved the column forward in one body, with colors flying and band playing. He moved in the direction of the accumulating warriors from the other villages, as if he was continuing his attack, and this feint worked. Whether the warriors did not want to risk harming the 53 women and children, or they wanted to protect their own families, they did not attack Custer, but they raced back to their own villages. Once it was dark, Custer backtracked and rode away under the cover of night, and he, the prisoners, and the Seventh Cavalry escaped. The Seventh Cavalry and their Southern Cheyenne captives from the Washita would arrive at Camp Supply. After a brief rest and refit, they departed Camp Supply on December 7th with General Phil Sheridan, and they returned to the Washita battlefield to find the badly mutilated remains of Major Elliott and the 16 other missing soldiers. They'd also find the body of white hostage Clara Blinn and her 2-year-old son Willie. The 7th continued southwest to Fort Cobb. On December 18th, Benteen would report sick, and he'd remain sick until December 25th. During this time, he learned that his wife Kate had given birth to a baby girl on December 13th. Kate named the baby after herself, Catherine Norman Benteen. Benteen also unfortunately learned that the baby died on December 16th. Barnetz's wife, Jenny, wrote, "Mrs. Benteen's baby died while I was at Fort Harker. She was in very low spirits. Her own health was miserable, and she was constantly anxious about her husband." It was in this state of mind that Benteen, on December 22nd, pens a letter very critical of the Washita fight to his war comrade, William DeGrasse of St. Louis. DeGrasse had been a captain in Benteen's Civil War regiment, the 10th Missouri Cavalry. DeGrasse would send this letter to the Missouri Democrat, and it was published on February 8, 1869. It was picked up and reprinted by the New York Times on February 14th. Here's a quote about Elliott's death from this letter. "Who can describe the feeling of that brave band as with anxious beating hearts they strain their yearning eyes in the direction when help should come? What must have been the despair that when all hope of succor died out, nerved their stout arms to do or die? But surely some search will be made for our missing comrades. No, they are forgotten. Over them and the poor ponies the wolves will hold high carnival, and their howlings will be their only requiem." According to Benteen, Tom Custer later showed Benteen this letter in the paper, saying, "Isn't this awful?" And Benteen supposedly said, "Why, Tom, I wrote that myself." Also, according to Benteen, he said that officers' call was sounded. Benteen, quote, "sauntered up. The officers were squatted around inside of Custer's Sibley tent, and Custer was walking around the center with a rawhide whip in his hand. He went on a rambling story, stammering the while that it had been reported to him that someone had been belittled in the fight at the Washita, and that if he heard any more of it, or he came to his ears who had done it, he would cowhide them, switching his rawhide the while." Being right at the door of the tent, I stepped out, drew my revolver, turned the cylinder over to see that 'twas in good working order, returned it lightly to the holster, and went within. At a pause in the talk, I said, "General Custer, while I cannot father all the blame you have asserted, still I guess I am the man you're after, and I'm ready for the whipping promised." He stammered and said, "Colonel Benteen, I'll see you again, sir." Benteen said that he later returned to Custer's tent, and Custer wilted like a whipped cur. As this comes up again and again and again in Little Bighorn Studies, let's take another look at the Elliott tragedy. Was Custer genuinely guilty of abandoning Major Elliott, or did Benteen use this episode as a catch-all for his grievances with Custer? Interpreter Ben Clark would say, quote, "The charge was made against Custer in after years that he gave the order which led Elliott to his death and then abandoned him to his fate. This accusation was false. Custer knew nothing of Elliott's going. Half an hour after Elliott and his men rode away, Custer came up and asked me what became of Elliott. The enmity between Custer and Colonel Benteen, which afterward grew very bitter, showed itself a day or two after the fight. Benteen, anxious to weaken Custer's prestige, came to me after it was believed that Elliott and his men were lost, and asked me if I would be willing to make the statement that Custer knowingly let Elliott go to his doom without trying to save him. I refused to have anything to do with the matter." And Godfrey, when asked if Custer was blamed at the time for deserting Elliott, said, "No, as far as my knowledge goes. We were betting we would find Elliott with the wagon train, thinking that in following the dismounted Indians, he had, on returning, found the hostiles practically surrounding the village, and that he thereupon detoured and went on the back trail. The fact that the heavy firing I had heard, when on the opposite side of the valley, was almost continuous with that of the command of Captain Myers, who was defending our occupation of the village on that side, dispelled our first impression that it was Elliott's party. Myers had followed the hostiles some distance down that way, but not far enough to discover Elliott's party." So even though Godfrey and Myers were the closest to the Elliott death site, while the fight was going on and Elliott was fighting for his life, they didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Benteen never blames them. Benteen writes in an 1894 letter, more than 25 years later, quote, "At the Washita we lost Major Elliott, and damned if any search was made for him till a fortnight later." Though other times Benteen will admit Elliott's death was the fault of no one but Elliott, as in this later letter excerpt. "Elliott, like myself, was pirating on his own hook, allowed himself to be surrounded, and died like a man." But Benteen has a litany of other accusations against Custer. He's still angry at Custer for taking a year to pay him back the $100 Benteen had loaned Mrs. Custer. And 25 years later, he's still making vague comments about Custer being part of a corrupt post-trader ring and about his pushing some of Benteen's friends out of the Army. However, there were legitimate concerns about the Washita that bothered quite a few other officers too. Custer only recommended brevet promotions to Captain Hamilton, who had died in the fight, and Captain Barnett's, who had been really badly wounded. None of the other men's many acts of bravery are mentioned in Custer's official report. And in this very competitive army, when promotion was so hard to come by, this was seen as quite a slight. And from our earlier discussion about Benteen's Civil War service, we know Benteen already felt that he had been too often overlooked in the past. None of these wrongs, though, have quite the same power as accusing a commander of abandoning his troops in a time of war. We'll see in a later installment how, after the Little Bighorn, especially at the Reno Court of Inquiry in 1879, Benteen will publicly bring up the Washita fight in an effort to show Custer's failures as a leader. The 7th Cavalry, now joined with the 19th Kansas Volunteers, continued the campaign against the Southern tribes all the way until early spring 1869. The mission was to coerce the tribes into the agencies and to free white female captives who were being held by the Southern Cheyenne. The 7th managed to do this without fighting or burning any more villages through a series of negotiation and continuing to take additional Cheyenne captives to use as bargaining chips. On April 4th, as the 7th was returning home, Benteen's company was left on detached service at Fort Dodge. Remember, Benteen had lost a baby in December, and his wife was very ill. He considered this, quote, banishment as Custer's revenge for that Washita letter to the newspapers. But Benteen proved, as usual, quite crafty. When he became the acting commander at Fort Dodge, he gave himself an assignment of detached service to Fort Harker from April 19th to May 15th. He quickly went home to visit Kate and young Freddie and managed to take a trip to St. Louis to visit his family as well. When he returned to Fort Dodge, he met the Department Inspector General. Benteen told him about his complaints, and on June 2nd, he managed to get sent to Fort Hays, where Benteen, Kate, and little Freddie were formally assigned. Life at Fort Hays was rather uneventful until March of 1870, when a new major was assigned to the 7th Cavalry, Major Marcus Reno. At some point that spring, Reno and Benteen would get in a little scuffle. Benteen said that Reno tried to bully him. He'd write, quote, "I slapped his face," in the clubroom of a post-trader's establishment before quite a crowd of officers. I told him he was a dirty SOB, and if he wanted any other kind of satisfaction, I was only too ready to afford it. And that, my friends, is a good place to pause for today. That was a lot of material. You guys are incredible to have hung in this long. I think the Washita fight is really key to understanding Benteen and Custer's very complex relationship. And as I said in the very beginning, Benteen will circle back to the Washita fight and his early grievances with Custer up into the late 1890s. So good for you for doing that bit of research with me. Please subscribe. I have more in the works, obviously, and really appreciate those of you who have subscribed already and friends who have watched. Really big thank you to my partners in researching crime on the 7th Cavalry and Benteen in particular, Dale and Annie. You guys rock. Thank you so much for helping me out with this. The next slide is just book lists of those texts that I used putting this together, and I play some fun music in the background, so I'm going to let that play for a few minutes. So again, thank you everybody. Please subscribe and click your little bell for notifications for when the next installment comes out, and there's other 7th Cavalry presentations in the work. Really appreciate it. Thanks. Hope to see you again soon. And book lists next. Oh, and leave me comments. I love comments, and I try and respond to all of them, so just right there below. All right, enjoy looking at the books. All right, guys, here are the promised book lists I mentioned. I'm going to leave this up for a little while so that you can look through and see if there's anything you're interested in reading yourself. Thank you so much. Come back again, all right? Thanks, guys.